Hey everyone, before we get started with the video, I just wanted to let you know that my annual Black Friday sale is coming up. It will be held from the 26th of November 2021 through the 29th of November 2021. So this is the single sale that I do each year, and it's the one time a year that you're able to get BP Autosports products, being manifolds, being merge collectors, catch can, coolant overflow combos, fill pots, and what have you on sale. And the sale will go live on the 26th of November at www.bpautosports.net. The website is linked in the description below, and I look forward to the orders that you all place and look forward to building parts for you. So now that that bit of housekeeping is out of the way, let's go ahead and get started with the video. Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. And sorry for missing last week's video. Just had way too much on my plate, but we are back again to make some more progress on the silver car here. And I did manage to do a couple of things during the week that helped further the project along a little bit that weren't necessarily, or they wouldn't be the most interesting things to see on camera. So I guess let's take a look at them now. And the first of which is I went ahead and I started on the steering column. And don't fret, we're going to work on this some today so you guys can see more of the process. But all that I've done so far, see if I can get the wheel off with one hand. All right, all that I've done so far has been the splined gear portion. I scavenged that off of the old steering column over there. And I centered it and everything else and welded it onto the internal portion of the column here. So that way I can put the steering wheel on the column and figure out the rough spacing and distance that I want to use as far as where the wheel will be positioned as I'm sitting in the driver's seat. Now, the factory one obviously did all this for me, but since this is a universal aftermarket column, I have to figure out all of that myself. So we have that done. Obviously punched a hole in the dash there to allow the column to pass through. And I went ahead and you can see this little bit of rock with the billet race pack bezel. I got that squared up so it sits level, at least to the eye, as you're sitting in the driver's seat, as if it did not, then it was going to drive me absolutely crazy as I'd be sitting there driving the car. So beyond that, also went ahead and finally have a hot side intercooler tube that fits everything. You can see the gap between our turbo screen and the tube, as well as the tube and the radiator. So all of that is taken care of. Only took 3 times to get it to this point, but it's all good now. I don't have to rebuild the tube again, and that makes me very happy. So with the housekeeping out of the way now, let's go ahead, pull the intake manifold, and start working on the steering column. Alright, I went ahead and I got our little spline section cut off and prepped, and it's all ready to go. And I have this positioned in the vise like such, so I can measure the overall length of this U-joint in this section of the steering shaft, or steering column rather. So what I'm going to do is to take the column in the car, figure out where it matches up to the splined portion on the steering shaft currently, and then subtract 9.5 inches from wherever that mark is from the top of the soft jaw here that's sitting flush with this collar to the very bottom, or the flat section of our splined little doodad here. That's roughly 9.5 inches. So all we're doing is figuring out where things match up, marking, measuring, cutting, so on and so forth, And before long, we'll have this all prepped, and it can be welded onto our new steering column. So let me go ahead, go over to the car. We can mark out where our intersection points are and start cutting from there. And we have our spline section welded to the inner steering column. And I got lucky enough where the diameter of the spline section matches up pretty much perfectly to the tubing. So it will slide through our spacer or our concentric guide perfectly. So let me go ahead and reassemble this, and then we'll double check if our measure once, cut once philosophy ended up working in our favor. Seems like we are good to go. So it may look like the wheel sits back a little bit farther than normal, and it probably does, but due to my tall figure, and by the time that I'll be strapped back tight in the seat with the Hans and everything else on, I'd rather have the wheel be a little bit closer to me and a little bit easier to hold on to and to manage and everything else. So I think that we are good to go with our wheel position here. Went ahead and I tested to make sure that I would not be obstructed in turning the wheel, and I think we are good to go there as well. I can get in and out of the car relatively easily. I mean, you can see the jungle gym that I'm surrounded by, so definitely not as easy to get in and out of as my truck, but this and the truck are two entirely different types of vehicles, and this thing wasn't really designed for graceful entry and exit. But I think we are good to go here, and I'm not sure, see if you guys can see from my perspective. Oh, my head's right about here if I'm looking down. I'll have to end up bringing the column and the wheel up a little bit, which you can see the little marks that I have on the hole for the steering column right here. As if we sit as I'll be sitting, it'll be difficult to see the lights on the top of the race pack in the position that it's in. So if I move the column this way slightly, then that will eliminate that issue and we'll be good to go there. But column's in a good place, very happy with this, and now we can move on to looking at what the other portions of this video are going to be, as I'm not 100% ready to fully mount the column in just yet. That'll be for a later date. So let's go see what else we have in the chopping block. Since we are extraordinarily close to being able to start acquiring the parts to plumb this thing, I wanted to go ahead and get both the water pump and, time permitting, the transmission cooler mounted in the front of the car. So the water pump, and looking around at this a little bit, it will end up living somewhere on the frame rail here. And that will give me clearance to the dry sump pump. That will give me enough space to run the inlet and the outlet fittings of the water pump. Will clear the intake manifold and keeps all lines and things of that nature out of harm's way from rotating components from the belt and what have you. So I need to figure out the best course of action to get this mounted. And unfortunately, I don't think I'll have enough space to use my riv nut tool, so we'll be working with the factory threaded holes that we have here, wherever they may be. So it's going to be a little bit more cumbersome than it would be putting it on the firewall or what have you, but I think that's the best place for it. Easy serviceability from the bottom side, and cleans up the front of it. It's one less component that needs to be dangling off the front here, and I'm not too keen on threading the pump directly onto the radiator, nor do I believe that I really have enough space to do that. Probably not, but maybe. I could put this directly on the radiator if I wanted to, with a little spacer fitting, but I don't really like that. If the car comes down off of a hard wheelie or something along those lines, then there's a high probability that the pump will contact the ground, rip the pump up, rip the radiator up, and those are things that I really don't want to deal with. So now that we have the steering column mocked up, roughly put into place for the time being, I can go ahead and put the intake manifold back on. So that way I'm not guessing as far as clearance is concerned for the water pump, and we can start figuring out what the best course of action is going to be as far as a mounting plate to put the water pump on and to get everything sitting harmoniously on that side of the engine bay. As with all things on a car like this, mounting components ends up being a balancing act between where is the most convenient for service, where can it fit, where can you make lines run to and from, and so on and so forth. And this water pump mount is no different. So we're working with a tight little space, or I guess not that tight, but we're working with a finite space, rather, between the dry sump pump and the intake manifold and steering shaft and all of that. So it looks like this can sit back past the end of the dry sump pump and still have plenty of clearance to everything else. And that will actually end up making my life a little bit easier in terms of running lines to and from it. However, locations of threaded bolt holes, they are few and far between on this frame rail. And as I said, I don't have an easy method aside from buying another riv nut tool to install riv nuts onto the side of the frame rail to hold a mounting plate in place, as I want to have a plate be removable so that way I'm not undoing 5 fasteners to pull the pump out if I need to. I can undo a couple of easily reachable ones, pull an entire plate out, service the pump, what have you. So there is actually quite a bit of room here, and running lines to and from it will not be the end of the world. It'll just be a matter of figuring out the style of plate that we need to make, the design of the plate rather, and how to fasten it onto our frame rail here. I have an idea of how I can do it, but I just need to figure out the threaded hole situation on the frame rail first. Now, in looking at the transmission cooler, I want to have my inlet and outlet on the rear side of the car, and this space right here is what I allotted for the cooler to sit in. And we have plenty of room, but figuring out how I want to mount this, again, is going to be the difficult part, as there's no structure in this area underneath of the cooler right now. So I'll end up having to bend a tube to make that happen, at least a tube, maybe 2 tubes, and then welding together or what have you. But I want to have the cooler positioned in this area, as there is this duct right here, if you can see where my hand is, that will allow fresh air to reach the cooler without the fan having to do all of the work. So again, it doesn't look like it will be impossible to do. I need to take into account the position of the turn signal here, the turn signal housing, as I would still like to retain the factory and turn signals on it, but I'll have to build a tube that comes off of the existing tube nose, ties into some threaded bosses on the bottom side of the cooler and figure out a way to loop that tube around, tie it back into somewhere on the bottom side of the car here, and probably tie the top side of it into somewhere on the substructure of the core support and the front end support up there. So there are quite a few considerations and things that we need to take into account as we are doing this, but I think we have a game plan now, or at least a direction to flail in. So that, I think we can get this done. The jobs of mounting both of those components, I'm not going to get to them today. It's about the time that I have to get out of here right now. Have some prior obligations to go and do dinner with some old friends that I have not seen for quite some time. So it's going to be nice to see all of them and get out of the shop for once and go do something other than welding and fabrication and building this thing right here. So I'll catch up with you guys tomorrow. We can get started on those two mounts and see how far we get with them. We are back to work more on mounting the last few plumbing components for the Supra before I can make the massive order of fittings and hose and what have you to plumb it and to get us one massive step closer to the completion of this project. So the plan yesterday, as I outlined for you guys a few seconds ago in this video, was to attempt to mount both the water pump and the trans cooler that is sitting over here on the bench. And you'll have to excuse the bit of heater noise. It's finally entered winter weather season here, so shop's just warming up, so I'm not freezing as I'm in here working, so there'll be a little bit of background noise, but not the end of the world. But back to the point at hand, I sat and thought more about how I wanted to mount the water pump and the architecture of our frame rail here, and I realized that I needed to order another tool to do it the way that I want to. Now, you guys have seen me use my Astro Tools riv nut tool multiple times in the past, and it works phenomenally well. However, you are constantly dealing with spatial confines with it, and the distance between the engine block and the frame rail disallows the use of that tool unless I were to pull the engine out, which I'm not going to remove the engine to put a couple of riv nuts in place. So I went ahead and I ordered a riv nut tool that more closely mimics a traditional style rivet tool that will work in a tighter confine, as well as multiple new riv nut inserts and what have you. So I don't have those today, so I'm going to opt against working on mounting the water pump today and instead focus my efforts on mounting the transmission cooler. So with that in mind, what we need to do first is to put our two threaded bosses onto the transmission cooler that you can see are sitting on top of it here. These are M8 125 threaded bosses, and I'll weld those onto the bottom of our transmission cooler here, and that will give us a base to build off of in terms of where it's going to lie and being able to consistently replicate its placement in the fabrication process. Beyond that, we have a piece of Home Depot special seamed steel tubing. It is 3/4 inch diameter, and that's probably 3 feet long or so of it. And I'll probably end up having to go pick up a second stick of that tubing, but that's not the end of the world. But that tube is going to be what we build the mount for the trans cooler off of. It will come somewhere off of this radius on the tube nose, snake around, and so on and so forth. And you'll see more as we make our way through this project how exactly I plan to implement this transmission cooler and the mount into the architecture of the front of the car. So with all of that being said, let's go ahead, get the welder fired up. We can weld those two threaded bosses onto the bottom of the transmission cooler and then proceed from there with how we're going to how we're going to mount it and get this project knocked out. I went ahead and I made the first two parts of the mount for the transmission cooler off camera. They're fairly simple little parts, not that interesting, but let's go through them and I can show you guys how they work. So what we have are these two little cup mounts, and what they do is they allow an M8 125 fastener to go into them and to thread and hold the transmission cooler to the mount that I'm going to build. So I have two for the two mounts on the bottom of the transmission cooler, and we can go ahead now, put these on the bottom of the transmission cooler on those threaded bosses, and we can go ahead and start making the first tube that will attach to the tube nose on the car and hold all of this in place. So the way these are constructed, I just took some flat 1/8 inch strip stock, drilled an 11/32 hole into the strip stock rather, as 11/32 is a really good size for M8 fasteners, and I welded them to pieces of 3/4 inch tubing that I had, extra tubing actually, that came from the steering column, and the tubing is 1 inch long to allow 3/4 inch tube to easily be coped to fit to the side of it. So pretty simple little parts, but definitely a necessity to start building this mount. So I'll go ahead, put these on the bottom of the transmission cooler, and then we can start figuring out what we need to do in terms of the first bar to begin holding the transmission cooler in place once and for all. So we are going to be doing something that I'm really not that good at, I don't have that much experience with, but it is a necessity for building this mount, and that is bending tubing, i.e. or e.g. building roll cages, things along those lines. I've never really done it that much. I've fiddled my way through a couple of simple bending projects on this car, but I am definitely quite green when it comes to effectively bending tubing to make structures. But it's a necessity for this, so I'll just suck it up, figure it out, and we will make this happen. So I have our two little cups on the bottom of the cooler here. The cooler is roughly in its home, and we can get the first tube, the first bar bent that will go from our tube nose here to this first cup right here. So let me go ahead, get that piece of tubing, and we can start figuring this out, and hopefully it won't be too painless or too painful or too cumbersome to accomplish this. After the transmission cooler dropped on the ground like we were testing a pair of night vision goggles, we now have the mount, or the beginning of the mount, tacked in place. So we have our first bend coming to this cup here, and now we have to go from this cup back to the tube nose somewhere over in this area, put a linking bar between the two, and then figure out if we need any gussets or anything along those lines, or if I'm going to put a mount from the top of the transmission cooler to part of the front substructure of the car. So a little bit sweaty, a little bit irritated, as I was not really anticipating nor desiring to drop the transmission cooler from 6 feet in the air onto the ground. But it happens, and nothing broke, thankfully, so all is well there. We have clearance to the dry sump tank, we have clearance to the Wiggins assembly there, and we have plenty of clearance to the tire, and we will have clearance with the two lines to the tire as well. So all is well there. for once we accounted for all points of contention with the location of the cooler. So now we can go ahead, build that second bar, get it a little bit more firmly put in place, and we can keep moving forward with this mount. I really dislike doing projects like this. As I said at the beginning of the video, I'm not someone who bends tubes. I'm not your guy for roll cages, not anything like that. But I was able to fiddle my way through this, and it actually didn't come out too badly. So let's take a look. So there's everything from the front. You can see some of the mount from the front side right here. And I guess here's a little bit better view of that intercooler tube. So nice clearance everywhere there. But what we are focusing on is our little transmission cooler mount. So we have a nice bend coming into this cup, straight bar across, and then another bended bar that goes back up to the tube nose right there. So there are some gaps, as I've said multiple times in this video. This is outside of my wheelhouse, but I'll make it work, and with a little bit of dolly work and some filler rod and what have you, this will work out perfectly fine. So I guess now the next order of business will be to remove the transmission cooler so I can weld all of these seams. And at that point, we'll be ready for paint, reinstallation, and then I can determine if I want to put an auxiliary mount on the top side of the transmission cooler or not. So let's go ahead and pull this, get to welding, and before long we will have the transmission cooler mounted and one additional project knocked off the list of to-dos for this car. After stepping pretty far outside of my wheelhouse of things that I'm comfortable with and like doing as far as welding and fabrication go, we have the transmission cooler mounted on the front of the car. So here's what we ended up with. We have our nice radius bar here, our linking bar, and then our other bent bar that goes up along the bottom side here. It is pretty solid in place. I still may put a top mount on it, but we will cross that bridge at a later date. But with the bumper off, this thing looks pretty killer. I absolutely love how everything is filled out in the front here. Love the look of everything, and I am absolutely ecstatic that we have one more plumbing component mounted on the front of the car, leaving one to go in the form of our water pump. But another huge item checked off of the list of to-dos for this thing before we can enter the next phase of the build. Aside from building the transmission cooler mount, we had a new part come in that is roughly mocked up on the car as it sits currently. So let's take a look at what it is. And here we have our manual brake master cylinder by Buck Performance. And this is a really, really neat piece. Saves a bunch of headache if you were to, or as opposed to doing all of this yourself. Comes with a master cylinder, the reservoir, Comes with an adapter piece that is set at an angle that puts it level the way that you'd want it to be and matches up to the bolt holes, or to the bolt pattern rather, on the firewall of a Mark IV Supra. So Buck offers these in a couple of different master cylinder bores. He offers it with a line kit as well, which I opted against as I'll build my own lines. And the couple of notes to take into account with these master cylinder setups are: you want to be sure that you bench bleed it before you put it into service. It'll make your life easier, and you'll be less likely to damage internal components of the master cylinder, as opposed to trying to do it all in the car with the master dry, as the fluid makes up a little bit of padding, and without that padding you can end up damaging the inside of the master. Beyond that, you also need to be careful when you're tightening these down to the firewall to not end up destroying pieces of the metal on the firewall or distorting them or what have you. And this one obviously is loose as it sits right now, as I just wanted to test it to make sure that it does clear my fuel pressure sensor, which, if I can do this with one hand, the connector comes off and goes back on without issue. So really cool piece, and thank you very much, Buck, for providing that for the Supra community. Makes what could be a nightmare of a job much easier, and very nice piece. Can't wait to use it. And the one last thing I wanted to show you guys in this video is a little present from my friends over at Ace Race Parts. Now, before I show you, to be fully transparent, this was a gift. This was not a brand deal. This is not me trying to sell you parts or anything like that, as I'm not too big of a fan of the brand deals and people selling products on YouTube videos this or that way. Seems a little bit disingenuous, and I'm a big fan of building the reputation as opposed to buying one, which Ace Race Parts certainly has with me. So they sent me this really cool banner, and I got a tracking notification that there was a package coming. Was not 100% sure what it was, and this is what showed up, and I think it is just awesome. Ace Race Parts has been wonderful. They've been a wonderful supplier. I've had a wonderful relationship with them for pretty much the entire time that I've been building exhaust manifolds. And they just keep providing exceptional service, prices, and everything else. So to Rich and everybody else at Ace Race Parts, thank you guys very much. And this means the world to me to be able to fly your banner in my shop. So with all of that being said, and another project or two, I guess, with working on the steering column being knocked off of the to-do list for the car, that's going to be the end of this video. We'll get back to it probably by next weekend, and I really want to work on getting the water pump mounted. Just have to wait for the new tool to arrive, the new riv nut tool, but that's going to be it for this episode. So, as always, be sure to subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment, and I'll see you guys in the next one.